Well, actually, that depends. The reason why Asperger Syndrome got taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is an American thing, was basically if you have two young children, you cannot tell which of them will stay sort of low functioning and which ones will be high functioning and be able to live independently, even hold down jobs. Also, a professional in the area, medical professional in the area, told me that when people get to adults, they can't tell the difference between autism and Asperger syndrome, and therefore they just diagnosed everyone with Asperger syndrome. So that's why it all got amalgamated, is because it was basically proving impossible to tell the difference. Even before then, the only real difference quite often was whether somebody spoke late or not. So those children who were very late speaking were more likely to get a diagnosis of autism, and those who spoke without too much delay, either at the normal time or without too much delay, got diagnosed with autism.
Asperger syndrome.
Oh, Asperger syndrome, yeah. Basically, they say that autism is a spectrum. It's a linear thing. It goes from mild to severe. In actual fact, it's more complicated than that. You have a whole range of different things, different issues that can be underlying the autistic symptoms. And for me, the severity of autism doesn't actually depend so much on the symptoms, which it does for most people, but on the underlying disorders. So you can have somebody who can have actually quite severe underlying issues, but who can still manage to live independently and sort of hold down a job, whereas you could have somebody else with actually the same or very similar underlying issues who is labelled low functioning. And it partly depends on the intelligence. It depends on a whole, and it also depends on character, how determined somebody is. However, it must be said that there are certain kinds of autism, certain kinds of underlying difficulties that no matter how determined you are, how intelligent you are, you will not be able to overcome them. So those, I suppose, are the truly severe autistic people. But it's all very much a grey area. No. That's a myth. Some autistic people are very good at IT. A lot of autistic people like to communicate using the computer because it takes away all the complications of doing face-to-face interaction. If it takes longer to type stuff than it does to speak it, if you type it, you have more time to figure out what it means. So online communication or written communication tends to be less demanding for an autistic person than face-to-face communication. But there are actually very few autistic people who are brilliant at programming computers. Autistic people have the exact same range of interests and abilities as the rest of the general population. So some are good at programming, some are good at writing, some are brilliant at art, some are brilliant at music. It just covers the whole gamut of stuff. We even know of an autistic person who's become a millionaire salesman. And when he was small, he would have been labelled as, quite severely autistic. No, there's very few people like Rain Man, as portrayed in the film. Very few autistic people can memorise card sequences. We have never actually come across somebody who can count approximately the number of matches if you throw them on the floor instantaneously. There are autistic people who are really good at maths and really good at mental arithmetic, but that's the exception more than the rule. Most autistic people don't have any particular special abilities. And also, many autistic people are actually quite articulate. There are some that aren't. There are quite a number that don't speak at all. It's a whole range of things. It's a autism is incredibly broad. With incredibly broad in symptoms and incredibly broad with what are the underlying issues. It's an umbrella term. It is absolutely essential that you get to know each individual autistic person separately and don't make any assumptions about them because they're autistic or they have this label. Well, for that you have to go back to the diagnostic criteria, which are basically problems with social interaction and communication, mostly social communication, and problems with repetitive and restrictive behaviours and interests. So the problems with social communication tend to manifest themselves in lack of interest in social chit-chat, difficulty with processing, which makes the face-to-face communication very difficult, makes it difficult to keep up with a conversation. It can go down to understanding things literally, not taking context into account, again because of processing issues, right down to somebody who doesn't speak. So even that is very broad. Restricted and repetitive interests, or behaviours and interests, they apply to the sort of things like flapping hands that autistic people stereotypically do. A lot of autistic people will struggle with, will play with fidget toys, which somehow became a craze for everybody to play with. So I'm not actually sure quite how significant that one is. Some autistic people have very, very strong interests in certain areas and are resistant to having those interests broadened, with the consequence that they have a very imperfect model of the world which makes their social interaction awkward. It can just boil down to somebody who's socially awkward. But in order to get the diagnosis, it's got to have a significant impact on your everyday life. That is basically down to a literal understanding of autism, because if you say, can you do something, an autistic person might say yes, meaning yes, I can do it, but not recognising that you are actually giving them a command. For some reason, and I don't know why, the imperative, an order in English, has somehow become offensive unless it's a child that you're giving it to. So you can't say do this, do that. You have to say can you or do you want? Whereas to an autistic person or to some autistic people, those just aren't requests to do something. It's a question. It's a simple question for information. So if you ask an autistic person, do you want to do something? And they say no, they are saying no because they don't want to do it, not because they're being awkward, but because they genuinely believe that you are asking them a question and they have a choice. They do not see it as being asked to actually do something. we have actually done workplace assessments where this has been a real issue, where the employer has been complaining that the autistic person doesn't do what it says they're going to do something and then doesn't do it, and the autistic person says, but they never asked me to do it. So what has happened is the employer has said, can you enter this data, for example, and the autistic person has said yes, and then the autistic person thinks they've just been asked a question as to whether they could do something, and the employer thinks that they've actually asked them to do something and the person has agreed to do it. No. As I said before, with the diagnostic criteria, in order to be on the autistic spectrum, your autistic difficulties have to affect you in a significant way, have a significant detrimental impact on everyday life. So if they do not have a detrimental impact on your everyday life, then you are not autistic. However, having said that, there is actually nothing in autism that you do not find in the general population, for the underlying issues. The difference with autism is they have more of these traits and they tend to have them to more of an extreme. So many people have hobbies. Many men follow their local football team. That could be a restricted interest, or be seen as a restricted interest, especially by their wives. But it doesn't usually have a significant negative impact on their everyday life. There are many people who are socially awkward, but they do kind of get by. Again, it doesn't have a significant and severe impact on their everyday life. The key thing is that autism is a disability. And if you are not disabled by your autistic traits, then you don't have autism. Simply because these traits, they happen throughout the population, and it's nonsense to say everyone's autistic. No, it isn't. Because some autistic people can cope very well with the structured social interaction that happens in customer-facing roles. There's a big difference between unstructured social chit-chat and the structured conversation that happens in customer-facing roles. There's a reason for that conversation, there's a point to it, it has meaning, it makes sense. Now, for some of these conversations, there may well be a little bit of preliminary chit-chat, but that can simply be learned. So it is possible for autistic people to be very effective in customer-facing roles. As I said, we've actually come across somebody who's a salesman and is a millionaire because he's so good at making sales. How does he do that? He simply figured out what the system is, and there is a system, in order to make sales. And he uses that system and he's a successful salesman. So as long as the communication has structure to it, there is no reason why an autistic person shouldn't be able to do it. It tends to be the unstructured, normal sort of banter and social chit-chat that they have trouble with. Basically, no. Some people are very resistant to getting a diagnosis. They don't want to know that there's anything wrong. And although the stigma about having autism has diminished, it is still there to a certain extent. Also, getting a diagnosis can be problematic depending on where you live. So we live in Leeds, and there is a Leeds Autism Diagnostic Service that you can self-refer to. But if you live in Bradford, it's not quite so simple. We don't have any up-to-date information on this, but they did have a diagnostic service, but it was closed to new people because the waiting list had got too long and nothing was happening. It might have changed now, we don't know, but it very much does depend on the area how long you have to wait before you get a diagnosis. And the employer may well need some help before it is possible for the person to get a diagnosis, even if they are willing to pursue one. For that question, I always point out that if you were examining somebody to award them a degree, you would not award them you would not award the degree based on an hour's interview. It is awarded based on quite extensive either coursework or exams or both. So why do you offer a job based on a short interview? Surely, in order to find out whether somebody can actually do the job or not, it would make sense to actually get them to do the job. So why not give them realistic exercises to do that reflect the work that they would do, instead of relying on an interview? After all, you don't want them to pass an interview, you want them to be able to do the job. But unfortunately, passing the interview can be a barrier. I think one parent told us that she had actually gone to an employer and said, look, my son can do this, give him some work, try him out. So they did. He got the job, but he works from home. What do we cost? For a workplace assessment, we charge $1,200. For 3 hours of autism understanding training, we charge £1,000. Well, you really need to explain why those accommodations are needed. In order to explain why those accommodations are needed, you've got to get to the underlying issues. Because people are more likely to actually implement a reasonable adjustment if they understand why. The problem is that in order to find out why, you have to get us in to do a workplace assessment. And during that workplace assessment, we will actually try and figure out what the underlying issues are and make recommendations based on those underlying issues. Most people, if you get them to come and do a workplace assessment, are more likely to just give you a set of standard strategies. And I can tell you it is no fun as an autistic person being on the end of standard strategies.
So it depends on the business and it depends on the type of help they need. Sometimes an employee within an organisation who has got a diagnosis of autism will contact us, and then they will ask for the information and that will be passed on to their HR managers, at which point the HR manager will either let the employee deal with the process themselves. So, for example, get us in, arrange the assessment, and all we need to do is to then send the report to the managers. And then other times it might be that the manager or the person that works in HR is our direct point of contact So they'll contact us about an employee, and we will deal with them. It might be that they'll ring us up once every few weeks just to ask us to come in and do a little bit of consultancy. Other times it might be a quick question. You did this assessment for our employee X. We've got this question. Can you give us a little bit of advice? In which case we tend to do a lot of on the phone support, or they might want us to come in and do an hour with them, just as an hour consultancy or a meeting. Yeah, so I think that from past experience with working with HR managers, it's often the case that it appears that the HR manager is given the employee the job of contacting us and also directing that process. And it might be that other HR managers that would benefit from having us come in and do a workplace assessment on somebody haven't sort of thought, well, maybe instead of me organising the assessment for the employee, which I might not feel comfortable with, and I don't know how the employee is going to react to that, giving them our details, giving the employee our details and letting the employee manage that process, and then it becomes much more in their control and might also work better for the employee, and then we can deal with the HR manager as and when it becomes appropriate.